What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Logical, Plausible, Probable. In this video, I'm going to be addressing a interesting response that I got to one of my videos the other day from Godless Engineer. Make sure you like and subscribe, and I would love to hear from you about different topics you would like to have me cover here on the channel. Now, the premise of my video that Godless Engineer decided he was going to rip to shreds was that if Darwinism explains how life exists and removes the need for an intelligent agent as its source, it therefore enables many of the standard arguments in favor of God to just be dismissed. Now, I was specifically addressing some of the new atheist activists who have actually done videos talking about this. Two of the most famous would be Cosmic Skeptic and Genetically Modified Skeptic, but there are many, many more. I even rhetorically brought up examples of the standard arguments and the common atheist responses, and ironically, Godless Engineer basically regurgitated what I said they say in his response. Now, in this video, I'm going to be focused specifically on his accusations of my ignorance regarding genetics. If you want to watch more of the philosophical parts of his response, there's a link in the description, and you can go check it out. This brings me to what my next video will explain in much more detail, and that is the genetic code, and more importantly, the information it contains. Atheists desperately attempt to avoid the premise that it actually contains real information and is not just purely deterministic chemical reactions.
I mean, it is just chemical reactions. Like I said at the beginning of this, DNA can be interpreted as a code, but that does not make it inherently a code. We can determine certain sequences, and we can know the effect of those sequences on the rest of the organism, or on certain biomechanical operations or chemical interactions within an organism. Like, we can determine those things. Just because we can determine sequences in DNA does not mean that it inherently contains code, though.
Here we go again, accusation of ignorance and that only creationists say there's a code. Nobody else says there's a code. It's just an interpretation. Godless, I gave you a chance to retract your positions. Now I have to give you an education and showcase how uninformed you are about the reality of nature, biology, and our existence. But before I explain in detail why you're wrong, let's take a look at what an expert says about some of the concepts I'll be covering so there's no confusion. There's this guy named Hubert Yockey. He's kind of a big deal. He's considered the pinnacle expert in bioinformatics. And in his book back in 2005 called Information Theory, Evolution, and the Origin of Life, he says, information, transcription, translation, code, redundancy, synonymous, messenger, editing, and proofreading are all appropriate terms in biology. They take their meaning from information theory and are not synonyms, metaphors, or analogies. I could just end this right now, since I'm not sure how much more of a direct counterpoint is needed, but we'll come back to this. Now let's dive into what a code actually is. In a communication system, on one side you've got the information input, which is then run through an encoder operating according to an alphabet table. It is then transmitted through a channel, accounts for noise interference, accepted by the decoder, then translated via a different alphabet table. This concept is a fundamental basic in information and communication theory and applies to every known code. Doesn't matter if it's a human language, computer code, Morse code, or the genetic code. They all follow this principle. However, in every known code, the encode and decode logic rules are arbitrarily assigned. They all have required an intelligent agent to assign the values. Period. Somehow, even the genetic code in our DNA fulfills all aspects of being a code and is recognized as a literal one. But people are so desperate to avoid an intelligent designer that somehow all of these things doesn't apply. Now, before I show you why this applies to genetics, let's get one thing straight.
But it is not a code, it's a chemical. It's deoxyribonucleic acid. It's an acid. I don't understand why you think it's a code. DNA is no more of a code than Diet Coke and regular Coke.
Yes, I'm aware of the chemical composition of DNA, but your stance is such a standard talking point from ignorant atheists. The DNA molecule as a whole is often referred to in papers as the hardware and the base pair sequences which constitute the genetic code itself as a software. It's also referred to as the overall operating system and the different subsets of the code it contains as different programs operating different functions. It is the medium which contains the code, not the code itself.
But it is not a code, it's a chemical. It's deoxyribonucleic acid. It's an acid. I don't understand why you think it's a code. DNA is no more of a code than Diet Coke and regular Coke.
Dude, this stuff is really not that complicated to understand the difference. Now back to information theory and DNA.
DNA it's an identical process to computer codes. And it's very interesting that computer ideas about computers developed early in the 20th century, and Claude Shannon comes along in 1948. There needs to be no question that communication theory applies to biology. Okay, all of these concepts can be applied to DNA.
Is that debated anywhere?
Only among people who are ignorant, frankly.
Okay.
Okay. People in the know do not debate
But not in
this
this
fact.
credible scientific community. This is well understood.
There is no credible scientific argument to try to say that applying communication theory to biology is somehow inappropriate.
Yeah.
There's hundreds of scientific papers that go very deep into the subject, and so, no, there's...
Now we're going to see that guy again in a few minutes, but let's apply some basics to DNA. Just like any communication system, the genetic code is the information source. It is encoded from the DNA alphabet into the RNA alphabet. The messenger serves as the channel. Then it is decoded by the ribosome into the amino acid alphabet for proteins. Now, just in case you've already forgotten, I've already established that this is not a metaphor or analogy. This is literal, and only the ignorant think it is an analogy.
But it is not a code, it's a chemical. It's deoxyribonucleic acid.
Now, before I go deeper into the programming aspects of the genetic code, let's take a quick look at what another expert has to say. This guy, Dr. David Abel, is a theoretical biologist who is the program director of the Gene Emergence Project, whose project is an international consortium of scientists pursuing the natural process derivation of biocybernetic and biosemiotic programming and control. Here's what he had to say in one of his many papers. The first problem with trying to reduce the cybernetic nature of molecular biology to a mere metaphor is that biological programming predates the very existence of metaphors. Molecular biology provided the model for the entire field of cybernetics. Genetic cybernetics inspired Turing's, von Neumann's, and Wiener's development of computer science. Had it not been for their observations of linear digital genetic control, computers might never have been invented. The argument is therefore untenable, if not amusing, that computer science generated only an analogy applied to molecular biology in the minds of humans. If anything, computer science is analogous to the formal logic of molecular biology that not only preceded, but produced Homo sapien brains and minds. At this point, I could go on establishing that the genetic code actually is a code and not just a metaphor or analogy, but supposedly I just don't know anything about modern science.
And again, the only people that have ever mentioned this or ever said this or ever expect this are creationists, just like you.
So let's take a look at something from just last year about codes. You might recognize one of these people from earlier.
I'm talking at the moment with Perry Marshall and Kevin Ham. Perry Marshall is from Chicago in the United States, and Kevin Ham is from Vancouver in Canada, and we have just taken part in the United Kingdom launch of a huge prize to be won by anybody who can produce the genetic code or a genetic code via natural process generating it itself. Perry, have I got that right, first of all?
That's right. Any code, any encoding, message decoding system that can come out of an emergent property from chemicals to code would qualify.
Yes.
And I think it's one of the most fundamental questions in all of science. And it just hasn't gotten the attention that it deserves.
That's right, it hasn't, and I think that's partly why we've been highlighting it in the meeting that we've just had here at the Royal Society in London. You can't get much more prestigious than that, can you?
No, it's
by the way,
it's delightful.
Yes. Now, question perhaps also to Kevin: does it really need to be 10 million? You know, I'm a scientist. To me, that's a huge sum of money.
Damn, dude, I guess you're worth 10 million. Just show up and tell the judges it's all just been an analogy and they've been duped by the creationists. Hopefully we've gotten this code thing all cleared up, but I also stated that it is a programming language and it would be ridiculous to assume technology that requires software could exist without designers and programmers. And I think Godless Engineer agreed with me. In the information age we currently enjoy, to me it's a completely implausible concept to conclude that HTML, CSS, JavaScript, PHP, WordPress, apps, or any of the other aspects of technology that utilize software, that they could possibly come into existence without programmers and designers being required.
I agree, that would be crazy to assert, but luckily that's not what we're asserting. That's not what anybody's asserting here. It's only you that's claiming that evolution would entail this. So you're basically building a straw man argument against people that already accept evolution and are misrepresenting their arguments for evolution. You see, the biggest difference here is that we have natural explanations for like why DNA looks the way that it does, why it operates the way that it does, and why the diversity of life that we have here on Earth exists. We have natural explanations for why these things happen. We don't have explanation for why like PHP exists, other than somebody designed it. So what you're really doing here is you're comparing bananas to horses here.
So let's look at some of the fundamentals of a programming language. First off, you need syntax and semantics. Now, syntax describes the possible combinations of symbols that form a syntactically correct program. In the genetic code, this is a very well-established concept. You have 4 base pairs, 3 of those pairs in a triplet equals a codon, and there's 64 possible combinations of that syntax. This is so basic, I'm not sure why I'm even having to explain this to you, but apparently I just don't know what I'm talking about, or apparently all the PhDs who agree on this are out to lunch. Now, semantics refers to the meaning of languages as opposed to just their form. In genetics, this is the applied meaning of the codon syntax to be symbolic of an amino acid. There's literally charts for all this stuff, as you can see. Now, here's where things start to get interesting. But before I go on, just let me address another common argument from ignorance.
I mean, it is just chemical reactions. Like I said at the beginning of this, DNA can be interpreted as a code, but that does not make it inherently a code. We can determine certain sequences, and we can know the effect of those sequences on the rest of the organism, or on certain biomechanical operations or chemical interactions within an organism. Like, we can determine those things. Just because we can determine sequences in DNA does not mean that it inherently contains code, though.
So just to clarify, the base pairs that form syntax of the genetic code, which is translated into mRNA, then decoded by the ribosome into amino acids, does not chemically turn into the amino acid it represents. It contains the information on what needs to happen. The semantic meaning decoded is what instructs a ribosome on which amino acid is correct. In fact, the codon represents the amino acid, never even interacts with it. A tRNA molecule which carries the amino acid has an anticodon which matches, but sometimes they have grabbed the wrong amino acid. So then the ribosome checks to make sure it actually is the correct one that matches with the codon, and if not, kicks it out. That's enough about semantics. There's literally hundreds of papers on this, and just like the genetic code actually being a code, this is a well-established fact of which you seem to be unaware. There's just no logical, plausible, and probable conclusion you can reach that says binary code will magically transform into syntax, semantics, pragmatics, and all of the other if, then, and else logic rules that are required for any type of programming to actually work.
And again, the only people that have ever mentioned this or ever said this or ever expect this are creationists, just like you.
Now on to pragmatics, which is all about context changing the meaning derived from strict semantics. This is one of the arguments against it actually being a language, but that has since been discovered to also exist in the genetic code. There's actually a variety of ways this is expressed via gene regulatory networks, transcription factors, translational pausing, and a plethora of epigenetic factors, or another recently discovered function of microRNAs, which change the outcome in thousands of ways, some of which are even directly dependent on temporal factors. Those if, then, and else things I referred to depend on literal syntax, semantics, pragmatics to be executed. And didn't we discover they aren't just analogies earlier?
All those things exist in our genetic code, and it is an accepted premise that this code is absolutely required for any form of life to function, let alone reproduce.
But it doesn't exist in our code. Like, our code doesn't have if this then that kind of statements in it. Sure, there are certain genes that if they're turned off, then other genes don't function. That's an effect of it, and the way that we interpret the effect of that one gene or marker or something like that, the way that we interpret that is in an if then that kind of way. But that doesn't mean that the DNA literally says that. It's our interpretation of how it works.
I could keep going, but it would take me hours to truly expand on this, and I think you get my point. Unlike what Godless Engineer claims, the genetic code is a code and a programming language and is part of a very sophisticated communication system, and apparently I'm not the only one who thinks this. In fact, those who are actually doing the research on this stuff are the ones saying it. But there's one more thing we need to cover before we wrap up. I'm looking forward to Godless Engineer's response, and just want to let him know I purposely didn't address a couple of his points and left out some very important additional factors which further prove my positions, because I'm really hoping he doubles down on his. My original video was all about Darwinism and the worldview that a higher power not being required for life is a foundational component for the new atheists. But I ask you, if it is not a reasonable conclusion that codes and programming in any other form could exist without an intelligent designer, but as I showed, codes and programming are required for life to exist, why would it not be logical, plausible, and probable to conclude a designer is also required for life? People like Godless Atheists claim I'm just creating straw man arguments and then clinging to a God of the Gaps mindset. That is not the case at all. I have spent the last decade reading papers, books, speaking with experts, and considering the implications of their discoveries. Godless, you can keep accusing others of being uninformed, but it's rather obvious you're the one who is ignorant on the fundamentals of our very existence. That's it for this video. Hope everybody liked it. So please leave your comments. Please like and subscribe. We've got a ton more coming in the not too distant future. And I hope we can continue to have these engagements and these ongoing conversations about some of the most important factors in our life and whether or not our mindsets on them are logical, plausible, and probable.